I moved to New York with this wonderful sense in 1981, this wonderful sense of a community. And I worked in a very closeted industry, and I laughed with all of my friends, most of whom were white-collar professionals, and we were lawyers and bankers and media executives and advertising execs and, very sort of, accountants and, really sort of, all the things doctors, all the things your parents said you should be, right? All these overachieving folks. And we all lived completely night and day lives. Fortunately, the vast majority, even in New York, of people were so clueless that particularly if you were young enough to not be married and not have people say, wait a minute, you're 40 years old, why aren't you married? Very few questions were asked. But on the weekends and in our personal lives, we could live in Chelsea or the West Village or, the East Village or other places where gay ghettos were being founded. And people started coming out to their parents and things. People started having boyfriends. People started talking to their parents about their boyfriends. And then AIDS hit. So here we were every day finding out about another person or seeing somebody who didn't look well and going, oh my God, I'm sure they're sick. There was grief both for all the people that we were losing. And then there was also the grief that came from the fear that I could be next. I found out I had HIV very early on. I took the test against my doctor's recommendation, and I actually didn't take an HIV test because there wasn't an HIV test. But fairly early on, we learned about T cells, which we all know about helper cells and suppressor cells and T4 and T8 and ratios and all these things, which have become part of our vernacular. And for a long time was how we determined people's immune status and how we should treat them was by their T cells. So I had a very well-known doctor in New York who was known as one of the sort of pushing the edge on research and all this stuff. And I went to him in 1982 and I said, I want to know if I have HIV. And in those days, our gay doctors were our STD doctors. That was mostly what we were fighting. Sexually active gay men in their 20s, we didn't worry about a lot of other primary care, but we did have to worry about syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia. And so we would see our doctors when we had the clap, and that happened on some relative, frequent occasion. And so I went to him and I said, I know we know about T cells, and I know that if you don't have a lot of T cells, it means you have AIDS. I want to know what my T cells are. And he said, I don't recommend anybody getting that test because there's absolutely nothing we can do, and all it will do is cause you anxiety. And I said, I know, but I'm one of those people that would rather know than not know. So I had my first T cell done in the fall of 1982. I still have the record. And I had 505 T cells. To put that in perspective, at those days, we said you should have 2,000 T cells, but anything under 1,200 you're in real trouble. So that meant, certain things. It meant, obviously, I was concerned about my own health. It also meant that I sort of felt like I, was holding the lighted stick of dynamite. And the question was, how long is the fuse, right? And not having any idea when the next shoe was going to drop. So every time I got a cold, every time I got the flu, I was convinced that, this was it. I was actually in a hepatitis B study in New York in 1981. And a lot of the gay docs were trying out these new vaccinations for Hep B. And so we were in a study, so they took our blood and they saved that blood. And so we have blood from San Francisco in 1980 and 1981, blood from New York, 1980, 1981. Well, when they went back and looked, they found HIV in some of those blood samples. They just didn't know what it was. It wasn't identified by, my Michael Gottlieb until 81. And then we didn't even know what it was and to call it until 1983. With hemophiliacs, prior to screening of blood for the HIV antibody, what typically when a hemophiliac got a blood transfusion, which they need to do all the time to stay alive, that blood was actually a combination of hundreds of pints of blood or at least dozens of pints of blood all mixed together. So we kind of think when we give blood that there's a little bag and that bag then goes and is given to another patient. That's not typically true. The blood is spun, it's mixed, plasma is taking it out, but it's mixed in with many, many, many people's bloods. So what would happen is, let's say that there were, 50 people who donated blood at a particular blood bank. That blood, and one of those people had HIV. The HIV in that blood from that one person would get mixed with all the other blood, and then that blood would be given to 50 hemophiliacs. For hemophiliacs, it was just a numbers game. At some point, they were going to get blood that likely somebody with HIV had donated and was spun and now is in theirs, and they're going to get HIV. So the hemophiliacs, we lost a lot in the early 80s. And then once we started screening the blood in 85 or 86, it just stopped. When the epidemic broke out in this country, there were these clusters discovered in New York that were from among Haitian Americans and people that were going back and forth to Haiti. So it became this, the Haitians have it. When you share a needle, a little bit of the blood from you ends up back in the syringe. So the next person who's using that syringe, there's just a remnant of blood in it. So you're basically giving yourself a pretty close to 100% chance of getting HIV if you share a needle with somebody who has HIV. It was known that anal sex was likely, a higher transmission rate than, for example, vaginal sex. That came out pretty quickly because people were like, well, otherwise, why aren't HIV positive men transmitting HIV to women in higher numbers? So we got this idea that there was something about anal sex, that the risk was higher. Having conversations that went beyond the gay community about what we do in bed and how that puts us at a higher risk of HIV were such dangerous conversations because the environment, the homophobia was so toxic, and we were constantly told it was a gay disease and it was gay plague and it was our fault. We were constantly told that whenever heterosexuals got infected, that it was because some gay man did something he shouldn't have done. We encouraged people for several years not to get an HIV test because we couldn't do anything for you differently if you were HIV positive than if you were HIV negative. We couldn't do a single thing differently, and yet you were subject to being kicked out of your apartment. You could be discrimination in your job. Your health insurance company would find out and potentially cut off your health insurance. There were all these negatives that could happen to you by knowing your status. Later, this is something we encouraged people to do. Find out your status, protect yourself, protect your partners. And we knew that when people did find out they were HIV positive, their behavior changed. HIV is a great big bell curve. So without any intervention, the time from infection to AIDS in the old days was assumed to be around 17 months, 22 months, 2 years, something like that. So you get infected, you didn't even know you got infected because there was no test, and approximately 2 years later, you'd have full-blown AIDS. What we learned pretty early on is we actually identified the disease because people came down with conditions no one with a normal immune system would get. So in the early days, I'm talking now 1981, 1983, 1985, you were likely to be diagnosed because you came down with PCP pneumonia. And that meant you have no immune system. As the 80s progressed, we did have some treatments that came in for some of these opportunistic infections. And what that did was allow us to fight those opportunistic infections off for a little while longer. We had a lot of hope around those medications, and they were mostly a disappointment. So yes, people got a longer period of life. Sometimes that extended period of life was not what one would call a high quality of life or even a very good quality of life, but we did extend out the length of time. Some people went from infection to disease in 6 months, and some people went from infection to disease without treatment in 7 years. 9 years, 11 years. And we even discovered that there's some folks, we call them long-term non-progressors, folks who've had HIV for more than 20 years without treatment and have never progressed to AIDS. So we've been monitoring them. There's a number of studies that are going on that are continuing with this group of people. As we got better at treating some of these opportunistic infections that were signs of your immune system being gone, so we got good at treating one. And so we had a drug called Bactrim, which we started putting people on, and it helped tremendously. But what happened is that opportunistic infection was pushed back. It was put in abeyance for a number of months or a number of years, but another one popped up. And so we started coming up with new opportunistic infections for people in the late 80s that were diseases that the people in the early 80s never even got to because they died. So we had things like PML and brain diseases and other things that became the vernacular in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's like, well, what's PML? Well, PML is something that you get when your immune system's gone and you didn't die of, KS, or you didn't die of one of the other things because we were able to put a Band-Aid on that and extend your life. It was a little bit like whack-a-mole. Every time we sort of whacked one down and got people a number of extra months, they'd show up with a new opportunistic infection that we then had to develop some kind of treatment for that opportunistic infection. So we learned lots of things there. We learned that HIV passes the blood-brain barrier, which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to, to clear in the body, and why we do a good job of suppressing the virus but not eradicating the virus. It also meant that HIV began to move in those folks that lived longer into becoming a brain disease. And so we had a lot of people whose last years, in addition to all the tragic side effects and the really lack of quality of life that we associated with the early years, wasting and diarrhea, they also, a lot of them lost their memory, they lost their cognitive abilities. And so there was, we helped a little bit in the mid to late 80s with some of these opportunistic infections, but it just became a different opportunistic infection. It didn't get a lot prettier. When drug companies started to see the size of the market for HIV drugs, the potential, and they had some compounds around that maybe they had tried for cancer that didn't work, we got the federal government to agree to essentially buy unlimited amounts of AZT. Yes, Burroughs Wellcome had to establish prices, but those prices were adequate. They were comfortable with them. So suddenly your BMS and your Merck and your trying to think of some of the earlier drug companies, and you're like, wow, this is interesting. It's an interesting challenge. Our scientists are interested in it. There's a pretty good sized market share, and the federal government has now stepped up and said it will pay for drugs for everybody who needs them. And in fact, when we look at it today, the vast majority of the successful drug treatments have come from private enterprise. I'm going to assume that someone today is diagnosed in a relatively timely fashion. And unfortunately, a lot of people, particularly from communities of color, are not. So if you're diagnosed in a routine HIV screening at your doctor's office and you haven't started to exhibit symptoms, you will be screened for HIV, obviously. We'll find out we have HIV and we'll immediately do a viral load test and a CD4 test. And in all likelihood, at a relatively short period thereafter, you'll go on HIV medications. I think the standard of course now is for most people to go on almost immediately, or at least within the first few months, depending on what those numbers look like. But we can say to somebody now that if you take these medications, and typically it's 1 pill a day now, 1 pill a day, once a day, don't have to worry about with food, without food, doesn't matter time of day, doesn't matter interaction with other foods. 1 pill a day, we can, and you do the other things you should do, eat a good diet and take care of yourself and things. We can promise you a relatively normal lifespan. Now, we caveat that a bit because our data only goes 20 or 25 years. So we know that people that we intervened with in 2000 or 2005 are still doing great 15, 20 years later. But we don't really know what happens after 40 or 50 years. So we have to caveat that a little bit with somebody who, for example, seroconverts at 22. And there is data that shows that people with HIV have about a 10-year shorter lifespan. But that's including a lot of folks who were infected earlier when we didn't have such good treatments. We used treatments badly. So it's not really clear, but it's very optimistic. We know we have 25, 30 years of good, healthy life, maybe more than that. We do know, though, that living with HIV and these medications have some long-term side effects. We see higher levels of cholesterol, hypertension, some side effects around diabetes, sometimes around bone and kidney loss. Many of those have been reduced drastically over the last number of years as the medications have gotten, but there are still some long-term effects. And one of the most interesting scientific questions is, we don't know if those long-term effects are actually from the medications or from the disease itself. Because even though we intervene with somebody and we put them on medications and their viral load becomes undetectable, it doesn't mean it ever disappears. We've only had 2 situations, and one of them is the Berlin patient who just passed away in the last couple of days. We've only had 2 people with documented clearing of HIV from their body. So we don't ever cure anybody of HIV. What we do with the new medications is we bring the level of virus down so low in your body that your immune system can respond and fight off the virus for a very, very long period of time and without a lot of work. So your immune system is not overtaxing itself. It's not exhausting itself trying to fight off this virus. We see that in other viruses. Your body, you recover from them, but you're just completely spent, right? And it takes you weeks or months to recover because your immune system had to work so hard to fight off that outside force. With HIV, on these drugs, your viral load drops for the vast majority of people to undetectable, and your body's able to fight it off for a very long time without overtaxing itself. HIV risk remains the biggest challenge for gay and bisexual men and members of the transgender community. It still remains the disease that most impacts our communities, that's the most sort of devastating if you get, that has the most life-changing consequences. But what about hypertension? What about diabetes? What about obesity? What about smoking? What about mental illness? What about substance abuse? All those other things that LGBT folks also get, just like normal Americans have. So we were able to change from AIDS Project Los Angeles to APLA Health and Wellness. And we went through a short analysis, and we realized that the AIDS Project Los Angeles, the APLA name, had strong brand recognition. But the word AIDS in the name was an off-putter for many people. So we sort of cut the baby in half, if you will. We didn't do a full rebranding to pick a new name and try to reestablish a new name. Instead, we used a piece of our old name, APLA, but added health to it. And so a lot of the younger folks now don't know what the initials APLA stand for, but among older folks, particularly our donors or people who had connections with AIDS Project Los Angeles before probably the year 2000, they go, oh, APLA, I wonder if that's and then they realize we're the successor to the organization they've known and trusted since the 80s.